Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to this special webinar. My name is Gregory B. I direct the Southeast Asia program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C., and I will be your moderator and host today. We are going to be joined by three fantastic panelists who I will introduce momentarily. Once we get through the initial remarks and questions for myself, we'll have an opportunity for audience to ask questions. So if you are watching this on either the Nikkei channel or on YouTube Live, please know that we welcome your questions. You can submit them by scrolling down to the bottom of the page, and you'll find a submission link there. If you do submit questions for the panelists, we would encourage you to include your name and your affiliation so that they know to whom they are responding. Now, the topic of today's webinar is Japanese relations with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And as I'm sure most viewers know, over the weekend, Japan played host to a special commemorative summit for the 50th anniversary of Japan-ASEAN relations, in which the leaders of all the states of Southeast Asia, excepting Myanmar, were present in Tokyo, along with Timor-Leste as an observer and the Secretary General of ASEAN. The commemorative summit took place on the 17th of December, along with a host of bilateral meetings between the Prime Minister and heads of state and government from around the region. The reason I think that this is so important, and as our speakers will highlight, is that Japan is arguably the most trusted partner for most states in Southeast Asia. Over the last 50 years, Japan has been a major contributor to economic development and peace and stability in the region. Japan is one of, if not the largest trading and investment partners for every country in Southeast Asia. And even as China has emerged as the largest trading partner in goods for the region, Japan remains by far the most trusted partner economically. And I think for many states in Southeast Asia, the preferred partner when it comes to investment and overseas development assistance. Japan is also a major partner in the challenges facing these countries in the 21st century, including the energy transition, the need to move more forcefully into the digital economy, food security, post-pandemic recovery and health security, and increasingly even traditional security matters, where over the last decade, Japan has emerged as a major security partner and regional security provider for the first time in a very long time. And we're seeing that this year, most especially with the implementation of the Japanese government's new is the rise of China as a major power on the world stage, and particularly in the region, which has had both benefits and negative repercussions for many of its smaller neighbors. This is particularly true when it comes to maritime security. So over the course of the weekend, in both the official summit and the bilaterals, we saw Japanese Southeast Asian cooperation on maritime security play a major role. On the 16th of December, the day before the summit, Prime Minister Kishida had bilateral meetings with several of his counterparts, including Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, in which Japan and Malaysia agreed to elevate their formal diplomatic relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And a major component of that was maritime security. Japan agreed to provide more security assistance to Malaysia to facilitate the modernization of the Malaysian Coast Guard and Navy, including the provision of drones and patrol vessels. We also saw a meeting between Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh from Vietnam. Those two countries already elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership last month. And again, maritime security was a major component of that elevation. We saw the two leaders this weekend agree to continue with the implementation of that. Just a few days later, as if to put an exclamation on that focus on maritime security, Japan and Vietnam held their 10th annual Coast Guard meeting, in which the two Coast Guards agreed to continue to cooperate, building up their capacities. And of course, perhaps most spectacularly, has been the development of Japanese-Philippine security relations over the last several years. And on December 17th, on the sidelines of the meeting, Prime Minister Kishida and President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. of the Philippines met. They reiterated their commitment to deepen their military-to-military cooperation, to negotiate a reciprocal access agreement, which would be the first such agreement Japan has negotiated with Southeast Asia, allowing Japanese and Filipino military personnel to train in each other's countries to build interoperability. And the two leaders highlighted that the Philippines has become the official recipient of the first grant under Japan's official security assistance program, receiving coastal radar systems from the Philippines, the first of which became operable on the northern coast of Luzon just a few days after the summit. Now, that is, I think, a very quick and very shallow mention of all of the myriad joint statements and deliverables that came out of this summit. There's much more than I can certainly cover in a few minutes, and I suspect more than our panelists can cover over the course of the next hour, but we will do our best. And so with that, let me introduce our panelists. First, we're going to hear from Professor Saya Kiba. Kiba-sensei is an associate professor at Kobe City University of Foreign Studies. We'll then turn to Dr. Aries Arugay, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman in Manila. And then we'll close with Ms. Sharon Seah, who is a senior fellow and coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center and the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. With that, Kiba-sensei, may I ask you to provide the first set of opening remarks?
Thank you, Greg. So I will first discuss the overall takeaway of the summit and then talk about the three pillars of the joint statement. So first, about the takeaway. The most important takeaway from this summit is that Japan could present a value-based vision. The joint statement acknowledged the significant progress of the wide-ranging cooperation and close partnership in the last 50 years and the growing role of ASEAN in the international community. And the joint statement say that our vision is for a world where the shared principle and values and where all countries can pursue peace and prosperity and uphold the principle of democracy, the rule of law, and good governance, and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So it means that our leaders actually confirmed such values and principles before discussing the area of cooperation and the tangible action plan. Then the joint statement presented three pillars. The pillar one is heart-to-heart partners across generations. Pillar two is named partners for co-creation of economy and society of the future. And pillar three is partner for peace and stability. The first pillar aims to strengthen people-to-people exchange, including scholarship programs, language learning, student and faculty exchange, intellectual, academic, and research exchanges, and career development exchanges. At the summit, Prime Minister Kishida announced that the launch of the 40 billion yen, or almost $3 million program called WA Project 2.0. It is a comprehensive human exchange program. This budget is twice as high as the previous WA project announced 10 years ago. So here, the reciprocity between ASEAN and Japan is key. Given the rapid economic and intellectual growth of ASEAN member states, the cross-border movement of people rapidly increased in the past decade. The WA project has focused on the reciprocal learning process, such as Nihongo Partner Project by the Japan Foundation, so that young Japanese people visit and stay and live in Southeast Asian countries and teach the Japanese language, Nihongo. And also, they learn about local culture in Southeast Asian countries. And so in that way, ASEAN is providing a learning opportunity for our youth. Around 3,000 Japanese people have benefited from such a project. And I was a member of the expert panel of the 50th anniversary of ASEAN-Japan relations convened by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. So we launched a final report and submitted it to the Cabinet Office in February this year. The report emphasized that Japanese people should renew their perspectives on ASEAN. So Japanese people should know more about the ASEAN, and I'm happy that this point was adopted in the joint statement of the summit. The second pillar of the joint statement is called Partners for Co-Creation of Economy and Society of the Future, which focuses on the economic cooperation. So what is new is that this statement addresses various common economic and social challenges such as disasters, climate change, sustainable energy transition, development gaps in the region, public health and welfare, supply chain resilience, and digitalization. We should be aware that ASEAN and Japan are now combating such common challenges. Our report of the expert panel also says, quote, ASEAN-Japan relationship can be no longer bolstered solely by public funds such as Official Development Assistance or ODA. ASEAN and Japan must build a more equal and multi-layered partnerships. So that was our statement. So we, the Japanese people, should be aware that our economic ties are no longer oriented in donor-recipient relations. We are facing the common issue together, and we are combating this common issue together. Finally, the third pillar is called Partners for Peace and Stability. This is about security. Well, the media always emphasize the US-China rivalry in the region and recent development of Japan's security cooperation policies towards the Indo-Pacific, including arms export and the new scheme of official security assistance or OSA. However, please note that the security was mentioned as the third pillar, not the first. The Japanese government is aware of the diversity of ASEAN member states. We are also aware of different threat perception of ASEAN member states and different attitude towards security. Japan knows that security cooperation with ASEAN is not easy. It is only possible on the solid ground of mutual trust and a sense of peace and stability. And there remains much room for bilateral level, such as Japan-Philippines, Japan-Malaysia, Japan-Indonesia, Japan-Singapore, etc., based on the local security needs. Well, Dr. Aries Arugay may also talk about security, and I will add more later. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiba Sensei. And with that, let me turn to Dr. Arugay. Aries, over to you.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to hear that Saya Sensei has provided us with the necessary foundations of the summit that was recently held. So let me just complement that by through 3 points. First, the idea that the imperatives of geopolitics as well as changes in the Indo-Pacific region basically feeds into the elevation of some of the partnerships of Japan with some Southeast Asian countries as well as ASEAN as a whole. And second, I'll try to provide some explanatory factors, the reason why Japan is trying to assert a better and a more present footprint in the region, and this was widely welcomed, in fact, by most, if not all, Southeast Asian countries. And I'll end my preparatory remarks with some of the challenges that will be faced possibly by both Japan and Southeast Asian nations. Let me just say that while Japan has not dabbled into pretty much the geopolitics of the region, it has increasingly seen itself as an important player in the Indo-Pacific. And despite while the summit may not want to couch the entire 50 years of relationship between Japan and ASEAN purely just on geopolitical imperatives, we need to mention the elephant in the room. The region has become increasingly more volatile, more uncertain, and in a way, US-China rivalry seem to have been monopolizing a lot of the discussions, not only on security, but increasingly on non-security spheres of activity and cooperation. And I think what Japan and ASEAN is trying to do is to veer away from this singularity from this idea that everything needs to be seen through the lens of US-China rivalry, not only because there are other issues at stake, and this has reference to socio-economic development of ASEAN as well as its other partners, but it's easy to fall into the trap of that everything is geopolitical. But we must recognize that this, as what Prime Minister Shida has mentioned, the compound crisis that may seem to be just geopolitical but would have repercussions in other spheres of human activity and cooperation. I think in terms of Japan's increasing footprint in Southeast Asia, you may notice that historical relationship between Japan and ASEAN has been quite challenging in the beginning. There were anti-Japanese riots in some Southeast Asian countries in the 1970s, and for example, the colonial experience of countries like the Philippines with Japan. But what a lot of analysts have been saying is that Japan has become very patient and very sustained in its commitment to help Southeast Asia and to pursue mutual goals as well as shared objectives, and as what Saya Sensei said, shared values together with other members of ASEAN. And to a point wherein, as Greg prefaced earlier, Japan has been considered as the most trusted. And this is not only because of sources such as the State of Southeast Asia report that Sharon might allude to a bit earlier, but even our own domestic surveys of foreign policy elites and even the public. Japan's image has drastically improved over the decades to a lot of Southeast Asian publics. And speaking just from the Philippine experience, the many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Filipinos whose lives have benefited from being able to work or gain employment in Japan, being students, as well as other people-to-people exchanges that we are seeing being reinforced with the declaration of the Commemorative Summit. However, as the relationship between the two countries could be couched as entering a golden age, something that both Japan and Southeast Asian leaders have tried to be optimistic about the relationship, there needs to be more, of course, due diligence on both sides. What's good is that Japan has couched its increasing security relationship in Southeast Asia with really a wide and a long-standing economic buffer. Unlike maybe some other major powers who are trying to somehow gain the trust and confidence of Southeast Asian countries, Japan has always been not only a trusted investor in ASEAN, but a trade partner and of course a donor before, but now increasingly more as a partner for economic development. But as someone who studies domestic politics, let's also not forget that whatever advances in the relationship between ASEAN and Japan or ASEAN countries pretty much depends on the stability as well as the predictability of its domestic politics. So long as there are domestic political, economic, and even social challenges on both sides, this might count as an unnecessary distraction in pursuing mutual goals. So therefore, for example, legitimacy crises, governance problems in Southeast Asia might have an effect on furthering this relationship. And of course, while it is a more stable country, Japan also might face certain domestic problems that might veer away from focusing on the mutual task at hand. I think I'll stop there and leave the remaining time to Sharon.
Thank you very much, Aries. And with that, let's have Sharon Seah close us out. Sharon?
Thanks for having me. I'm just going to talk about the transformation in the relationship between Japan and ASEAN and the reasons for that, and then I'll move into the kind of the areas that the two sides can work on to grow their influence. So like what Aries said, in the 1970s, we did see so many anti-Japanese protests that were taking place in the region, and in particular in 1974, when Prime Minister Tanaka arrived in Jakarta, thousands of Indonesians rioted on the streets, and this was a scene that had been repeated in the other 4 cities he visited: Bangkok, KL, Singapore, Manila. And Southeast Asia's unhappiness at that time had to do with Japanese economic imperialism. And this sentiment is shared by many in Southeast Asia, along with the collective memories of Japan's horrific actions in the Second World War. But since then, this relationship has transformed dramatically. In fact, just 3 years after those violent protests, a new Japanese prime minister put out what is now called the Fukuda Doctrine, which forms a cornerstone of Japan's foreign policy towards Southeast Asia. So from a very much feared and loathed imperialist power, it is now today Southeast Asia's most trusted partner. In fact, a recent Economist article refers to Japan as a cuddlier friend to Southeast Asia than US or China. So why is Japan the most trusted power? I think this has been a puzzle for us. And according to the survey that Aries alluded to earlier, the State of Southeast Asia, which is conducted by myself and my team on elite policymakers and opinion leaders, Japan enjoys nearly 55% of the trust across all 10 countries in Southeast Asia, and it's attributed to 2 main reasons. Firstly, Japan is viewed as a responsible stakeholder that respects and champions international law. And secondly, Japan is seen as having abundant economic resources and possesses sufficient political will to provide global leadership. So at this time of rising geopolitical tensions and increasingly fragmented world order, as well as the risk of an erosion in the international legal order, these are qualities that have reinforced these views of Japan as a reliable partner, very much a stark contrast from the 1970s. So Japan is now a middle power, seen as being able to strike a balance between Beijing and Washington, and this is evidenced by its participation in the US-Japan Arugay Trilateral Summit and its attempts to revive the China-Japan Arugay Summit. There may have been lingering fears of militarization in the past, but given these changing circumstances, I think a strengthening of Japan's security role might not be altogether unwelcomed. In fact, over 7% of respondents in the survey welcome this, and they say that Japan's military power can be an asset for global peace and security. And this is, although it's a small number, we see this as an increase from 2022's numbers. And this appreciation comes most strongly from 2 of the nearest ASEAN member states by proximity to Japan, and that's from Brunei and the Philippines. I think these countries are well aware, in the event of any conflict over Taiwan, that the most reliable partner who will respond in a timely manner is most likely to be Japan. So where in the past Japan's middle power influence stemmed from economic standing, now it comes from a tremendous pool of soft power in the region. Now, if ASEAN were a collective of 10 countries and can be counted as a middle power, I would like to suggest 3 areas to grow and exercise both Japan and ASEAN's respective middle power influence. The first is to buttress the international legal order through active promotion of multilateralism. And I think Japan has already taken these first steps by situating Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific with fundamental values and principles that align with ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And there are already really commonalities that the 2 sides can build upon. Japan has already started work on strengthening international rule of law by hosting an inaugural meeting of ASEAN and Japan's justice ministers at the G7. At the recent ASEAN-Japan's Commemorative Summit, all the ASEAN member states agreed with PM Kishida on the importance of upholding a rules-based order and expressed appreciation for Japan's support of the AOIP. So I believe that ASEAN can do a lot more by supporting Japan wholeheartedly in the pursuit of a multilateral order that works for all of us, instead of relying on external powers, as Aries has said, to frame everything in the US-China rivalry lens would be quite misleading and disadvantageous to all of us. The second is a pursuit of independent foreign policy, free of external interference or influence, including from each other. So in this regard, Japan has already been reviewing its foreign and defense policy posture, including the adoption of 3 key national security documents in 2022, an increase in military spending, a revision of its ODA charter to respond to the emergence of a new balance of power in the region. So some countries in Southeast Asia have likewise also sought to do the same in diversifying their defense partnerships and arms purchases. Vietnam's upgrade of its strategic relationship with both US and Japan is an example, while maintaining good relations with China, of course. And the Philippines ADCA agreement is another. The final point to make is that both sides seem to be intentionally pursuing this co-creation agenda. So one of the 3 pillars of cooperation, co-creation, has emerged as a buzzword for the next 50 years of ASEAN-Japan relations. And the competition for soft power influence actually really extends beyond traditional spheres of influence in terms of politics, defense, or economics. Today, digital and technological innovation are emerging areas that can propel a mutually inclusive growth area as a means to extend influence. So the Asia Zero Emissions Community, for instance, aims to jumpstart a green transformation. And all of these areas are areas that ASEAN member states are keenly invested in as part of their needs to meet climate mitigation goals and transition to low carbon economies. But to truly claim Japan's climate leadership position, as evidenced in another separate survey that I do as well, where Japan topped the leadership chart in climate action, I feel that Japan must release its baggage of maintaining its industrial basis in the manner of conventional economic growth and innovate on tapping into ASEAN's young, digitally savvy population by integrating systems and promoting value creation. So in this regard, PM Kishida's announcement of the Comprehensive Connectivity Initiative in September 23 will complement ASEAN's efforts. A final takeaway on the future of ASEAN-Japan relations. The relationship, it seems from the summit, is being recalibrated from one where Southeast Asia is a recipient of assistance to one where ASEAN is viewed as an equal partner who can contribute as much, if not more, to this partnership. So the emphasis on equal partnership comes through in the co-creation aspects of the discussions with the next generation in mind. I think this is a great recalibration because one, it is respectful and it accords equal status, no longer frames the relationship as a donor-recipient one, as Professor Saya has talked about. And two, it ensures that all partners are vested in the same vision and objective. So to borrow a sporting term, Japan is poised to become one of Southeast Asia's MVP, most valuable player, with several game-changing initiatives at play, those that I have mentioned earlier. So I really look forward to the discussion on how we can unpack this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Now we have some time for questions and answers, starting with my questions, and then we'll move into the audience Q&A. So for those watching, I encourage you to go ahead and submit questions, and we'll pull them out of the queue and begin throwing them to the panelists. But first, let me come back to Sharon and ask you to unpack a little bit the balance between Japanese engagement with ASEAN as an institution and Japanese engagement with individual Southeast Asian countries, because I think this is something that all of ASEAN's dialogue partners have to balance. The ASEAN states disagree with each other on certain issues, and each has different priorities, but it is important to give deference and respect to the institution itself. That is what gives particularly the smaller Southeast Asian countries the role of a middle power. Without ASEAN, Laos and Brunei are very small powers. With ASEAN, they can claim to play a middle power role in the region. So how does Tokyo, and by extension all dialogue partners, balance that?
Many dialogue partners find that it's very difficult to engage all 10 at once. And sometimes, especially in the last few years, the position of the ASEAN member states are not uniform. And it doesn't show that there is a unity in the kind of decisions that they make. But you still have to engage with ASEAN as an institution. So, but some dialogue partners then feel that this is a little bit too challenging, so they tend to go down the bilateral route, and they tend to want to engage bilaterally. And particularly, you know, where there are issues that are too tricky, then some powers will insist that we should talk to you bilaterally and engage without ASEAN. And as you said, Greg, ASEAN amplifies the agency that small states have. And this is something that I think the small states then have to decide for themselves. You know, how then do we ensure that we continue building consensus, continue to present a coherent front? For Japan, one of the best things about its relationship with Southeast Asia is it is free from conflict. Japan has no major bilateral disputes with any of the Southeast Asian countries, and it has worked very hard, you know, in that respect in the last 50 years to keep it conflict-free and to ensure that if there were any issues, that it will be resolved by means of international law. And there's no guessing, right, in the relationship. You know exactly and very predictably how the relationship is going to go about, as opposed to, you know, other issues. For instance, the issue of the South China Sea, which has been very tricky in the last weeks or months already. We've been seeing things happening at sea, on the ground, so to speak. And there's no predictability in that. And that really causes so much anxiety in the region. I think I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Sharon. Let me turn to Kiba-san. You want to address that question, but also if I could ask, since we just heard, I think a clear reference to China when it comes to disputes with members of South Asia, as opposed to Japan, which has none. Kiba-san, how does Japan think about its role in helping ASEAN navigate the relationship with China? And you know, areas where Japanese interests in perhaps pushing back on Chinese revisionism align with those of ASEAN?
In the past few years, we are learning that Japan is learning a lot about the approach, you know, how to deal with, how to address our security concern, our concern on the rule of law in the maritime security. And then we know that the ASEAN doesn't want to be divided. You know, the old Southeast Asian countries, they don't want to take side. So then they are afraid, they are quite afraid of the US-China rivalry in the region. So in that sense, it is not a clever idea to emphasize the threat of China, or in the, at least in the multilateral level, at least with the ASEAN level. So what we can do is to emphasize, repeatedly emphasize the rule-based international order, rule of law, and then what the democracy, what the freedom of navigation can bring to the region. What kind of public goods? What kind of public goods is realized through the rule-based order and free and open Indo-Pacific kind of concept? So that kind of tangible outcome, the tangible benefit for the Southeast Asian countries, we have to really emphasize that. Not really, you know, emphasizing too much on the security threat or the rivalry or any, you know, the threat perception towards some particular countries.
Thank you. Okay, now I have to bring in Aries, because some countries in South Asia don't have the luxury of pretending there's not a choice to be made here. Just 2 weeks ago, a China Coast Guard vessel rammed a Philippine Coast Guard vessel carrying the Chief of Staff of the Philippine Armed Forces, which in most contexts around the world would be a borderline declaration of war. So the level of coercion and threat that the Philippines has faced all year and will presumably continue to face puts the Philippines in a unique position. And thus we see the deepening not just of the US-Philippine alliance, but Philippine security ties with a myriad of partners, including Japan. Aries, can you situate the role of Japan in supporting Philippine security interests?
Thanks, Greg. Having studied how the Japan and Philippine security relationship has evolved, and Saya Sensei can also say something about this. What I've seen, the trend, it seems that Japan's increasing strategic and security footprint in the region uses the Philippines as some sort of a test case. Like, okay, let's do the strategic partnership with a Southeast Asian country. Oh, let's transfer military hardware, military technology, and now the talks for a reciprocal access agreement. Saya might remember that we've had many discussions over the possibility of this, and we were both a bit skeptical in the beginning of the year, if not last year. But we've seen how the momentum of increasing Japan's security role in Southeast Asia has been fomented by, of course, the increasing regional uncertainty. As far as the Philippines is concerned, Japan plays a critical role, and this is why it's not even just the current government, but even previous governments, even the past government of Rodrigo Duterte has emphasized the important stabilizing role that Japan plays as a way, not only as a buffer, but somehow as an alternative, one that is not as threatening and not as costly or risky as the two superpowers that are currently in rivalry. And this is why, but what's also important, if I may emphasize, is that Japan itself is also part of an alliance system with the United States, with South Korea, as well as other like-minded countries. And in fact, if we may remember, the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific is more of a Japanese novelty rather than an American one. Let's remember that former Prime Minister Abe alluded to the idea of the Indo-Pacific way before this has gained traction with other Western powers. So I think at the end, the Philippines wants to make sure that it is not showing the world, as well as other Southeast Asian countries, of the false binary that you either just choose the US or China, but seeing Japan not as the big superpower that could rival the two, but somehow as a vital partner to whom it has mutual goals and even values that it shares with.
Thank you, Aries. Saya, I fully understand your point that it's not a smart tactic to overemphasize the security matters when engaging with ASEAN. But we have seen a remarkable shift in Japan's willingness to engage on security assistance, and in many South Asian countries' willingness to receive security assistance from Japan. Why does Japan view supporting maritime security, in particular in South Asia, as so directly linked to Japan's own security?
Well, of course, to protect the sea lanes in Southeast Asia is quite important, and at the same time, the free and open Indo-Pacific, and then the safeguarding the sea, particularly in South China Sea, is quite important for the Japan's own security policies. And also to increase the like-minded countries to support, to directly or indirectly support Japan is quite important, which is that is for the first time mentioned in the National Security Strategy of Japan, which was adopted December last year. Yeah, and then so as Aries mentioned, the Japanese government tries to explain the new schemes, so new cooperation menu to Southeast Asian partners, and doing still testing the matchmaking between what we can offer and what they need. So the needs offer matchmaking is still ongoing, and we are still very new in this area. What is particular here is that I'm not representing any government officials. I'm not representing the Japanese government. I want to emphasize that that kind of security cooperation still maintained low profile to our counterpart in Southeast Asia, because some are still afraid of being criticized, that Japan will be criticized as anti-peace or undermining the Fukuda doctrine that promised that Japan will never remilitarize. Japan will not be the military power again. So that kind of fear is still spread all over Japan among the Japanese bureaucrats and policymakers. So that is the major difference between Japan and some other the partners such as South Korea. And then we try to, to deal with the new project carefully, very carefully, low profile. And then our bureaucrats try to talk to the like-minded counterparts, not to the public. So our OSA, the Official Security Assistance, or the security-related cooperation is not an open call, not an open call. It is determined by the bureaucratic level, honestly and quietly and frequently. So that's how the Japan try to enhance the security cooperation with our counterparts, our like-minded countries in Southeast Asia. And that I wanna say that the Philippines is actually embracing such an ambiguity of Japan. The Philippines is the most generous country which can understand that such an ambiguity, such an ambiguous offer from Japan in terms of security cooperation.
Thank you. Sharon, you've for years now led the polling effort that ICS does in the region with Southeast Asian elites. And I'm always struck by how you consistently see overlaps in Japanese interest with the US, the quote like-mindedness on issues ranging from the South China Sea to economic rulemaking. And yet Japan is not greeted with the same level of concern, right? You don't hear concerns that Japan's involvement in the Quad undermines ASEAN, but US involvement in the Quad somehow does. Japan engages in the same kind of security networking with the Philippines and Australia, but that is not seen as necessarily threatening. How has Japan succeeded in engaging in so much economic and security cooperation, even outside of ASEAN, without being seen as a threat to ASEAN centrality in the way that China and the US sometimes are?
Consistency is the key, I believe. And I think this is where Aries's point about, the changes in domestic politics and how that affects international relations and international politics. With Japan, even though we might see changes in government, heads of administration come and go, but still the policy is very consistent. Whereas when we look at the US, there are swings, big dramatic swings in policy direction, and that's something that it puts this level of doubt in ASEAN member states' minds. And in fact, already in this year, coming into the next year, as we watch the US elections, there will be some concerns. And we'll be watching, of course, US elections with a great deal of interest, because there is concern again whether there will be another swing in the US's direction towards Southeast Asia. So I think that's the key point. And so therefore, we see the consistency, even if Japan were part of the Quad, they often approach the Southeast Asian states in the way that Saya Sensei has mentioned, quietly, diplomatically at the bureaucratic level, and that provides a lot of assurance to the ASEAN member states.
Well, look, let's not ruin the upcoming Christmas and New Year's holidays too much by talking about the U.S. elections in 2024. We can all deal with that in 2024. But let's stick with the theme of consistency a little bit, Sharon. So one area where the U.S. has obviously been inconsistent over the last two administrations, at least, has been on economic rulemaking. The U.S. engaging and then withdrawing from the TPP, engaging in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but not being willing to talk about the market access provisions that would have made it possible to conclude Pillar 1 of IPEF, even though we have the other three pillars, and even a high degree of, I think, inconsistency when it comes to other U.S. efforts like the Blue Dot Network and the establishment of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which took very long to decide what they were going to do in Asia. Compared to that, Japan has been remarkably consistent in its economic approach to the region and its rulemaking in the region, engaging in RCEP and CPTPP and IPEF and so on. Can you speak a little bit to the role that perception that Japan is a reliable, consistent economic partner has in Southeast Asia, whereas the US is a reliable security partner, but a wildly inconsistent economic partner?
has in its stable is a very committed and strong business community in Southeast Asia. And oftentimes we do hear the business community, the private sector speak with almost the same voice and message from the government. So it doesn't deviate. And we know that the community, the Japanese business community has been in Southeast Asia for a very long time, and they are here to stay. So a lot of that consistency actually comes through, whereas the same messaging is not as evident in other foreign business communities that we come in contact with in our various different countries. So I think that really comes down to the Japanese government messaging it to their own community, and by extension that comes through to the companies that are operating within Southeast Asia.
Thank you. Kiba-san, can I bring you in on this question of Japan's economic engagement with the region as well? And particularly, how do you think Japan is thinking about the issues of kind of 21st century economic engagement, be it semiconductors, critical minerals, electric vehicle production, all of the things that dominate the news at the moment?
Those kind of new areas for cooperation, the economic innovations and the new area it's included in the summit agenda. And then the second pillar of the economic cooperation, it is simply because, or it's much more because of as Sharon mentioned, it's a business community, very solid, strong business community, business-oriented organizations in Japan, and they are keep lobbying as a group, as a lobbyist group, and then also as an individual companies. And there are a lot of, not only by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs level, but also in the other agencies, there are a lot of expert groups or the consultative groups on for this 50th years of anniversary of the ASEAN-Japan relationship. And then those business community, including the small and medium enterprises, those ideas are picked up by the Japanese government and then adopted in the action plan, the concrete action plans, I guess.
Thank you. And Aries, I don't want to force you to only talk about the Philippine-Japan security cooperation. So let's get your interpretation of Japan's economic role in the region, particularly in the Philippines, where the Marcos administration is putting so much emphasis on infrastructure, evolution of the critical minerals and mining sector, and an emerging Philippine role, hopefully, in semiconductor manufacturing.
Right. Yes, I'd like to respond to the question in the idea that this idea of co-creation, this notion that moving forward in the 21st century, Japan and ASEAN, they may not still be in equal footing in terms of innovation and technology, but I think the large investments of Japan in human capital development to Southeast Asian citizens, how many scientists have been educated in Japan, how many engineers, how many even those in the technology sector. This only means that these Southeast Asian trained in Japan scientists and technologists, they normally either they stay in Japan or they go back to their home country. So somehow technological innovation does not just follow the flying geese model of Japan developing innovation and then it gets passed on to Southeast Asia. I think moving forward, the idea that both are partners in co-creation means that moving forward, Japan also has a lot to learn on how 21st century science and technology and how it contributes to economic investments as well as to other semiconductor industry. I think that will be the shape of this economic relationship. So it is moving less towards the typical Japan as the investor coming into Southeast Asia, taking advantage of labor markets or cheap raw materials. But Southeast Asia has dynamically changed since that paradigm. And I think Japan is taking advantage of this as a power that has significantly invested. So it has walked the walk in terms of not only presence, but really putting a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of investment in not just human capital, but infrastructure in Southeast Asia. And that makes, I think, that buffer that I was talking to you about, that pretty much shapes how the perception that of Japan's reliability, predictability. And if you ask Southeast Asian elites and even the publics, they don't see Japan as just leaving the region just because there's a change of government, something domestically changed in Japan. It's a power that is not only polite, but seems to be in the region and is walking the walk.
Thanks, Aries. All right, let's turn to questions that are coming in from our audience online. And please do continue to send in your questions if you have them and identify your affiliation. Most of these are not directed to any one panelist, so I'll let you kind of put your hands up, whoever wants to jump on each one. The first comes from a researcher from Japan who asks, are Southeast Asian countries warming up to Japan's idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is something that Aries referenced, the idea that the FOIP was born in Tokyo, not in Washington, despite what the news media might report. Anybody want to start?
Maybe I'll start. Remember when the Indo-Pacific idea or vision or project first came about? Of course, there was somehow, I won't call it skepticism, but Southeast Asian, ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries were like, okay, let's figure it out. And thus far, ASEAN's official imprint, or at least reaction to the Indo-Pacific idea, is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And there have been calls for it to be updated and revised given the significant changes since AOIP has been developed. But looking at it, I think there's still a lot of course, ASEAN is still looking at the Indo-Pacific in a way that there's still, I mean, I think the skepticism has lessened, and increasingly you see some buy-in from ASEAN states. But I think Sharon might also want to say something about this. Like how ASEAN works is that there must be a little bit more patience, as Japan has been patient with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN's ability to fully somehow, I would call the term digest or even imbibe the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I think the way the idea has evolved, it increasingly is becoming more and more, if not palatable, truly something that ASEAN would, I think, even welcome.
Thanks, Aries. Sharon, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, the idea of the Indo-Pacific was actually expressed, I think, by Prime Minister Abe in the Indian Parliament in 2007, if I'm not wrong. So it has been 15 years for this idea to take root. And along the way, we've seen so many Indo-Pacific strategies that have been written up, articulated, publicized. And every time that there's a new Indo-Pacific strategy, my colleagues and I have to, look through all of those strategies to try and understand the concept. But I think what has been very consistent, really back to this point of consistency, is the actions match with the ideas and the concepts that's been coming through from Japan about the free and open Indo-Pacific. And it always comes down to principles, and principles don't change. So where Japan is concerned, it has been putting out its own principles, but interestingly, those principles align with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific principle. I have to say that in the early years, ASEAN was not completely receptive, has not been embracing of the concept of Indo-Pacific. But this has somewhat changed, in recent years, when I think slowly the policymakers are realizing that the concept is here to stay. There's so many people out there, so many countries that are already putting forward their own ideas of Indo-Pacific. So ASEAN better get on it and try to articulate it a little better. And Aries has said that, I don't think there's going to be any major reform, but they're just going to continue working on mainstreaming the 4 areas that they have picked out in the AOIP. to try to put more meat on the bones. And here is where it's interesting, because Japan is offering to put some of that meat on the bones, including the, this idea of promoting connectivity in infrastructure or in digital infrastructure and so on. So I think that's where if Japan works closely with ASEAN, I think it can slowly kind of like pull all the threads together to form a more coherent vision of the Indo-Pacific, where ASEAN sits more or less at the center of it all.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, our next question comes from a student from India. Do you think that certain elements were lacking from the Japan-ASEAN Summit or deserved more attention? Please elaborate. Anybody?
I'll go. I'll go first, and this might not be as conventional as a response, but if we have seen how Japan has couched its, for example, official development assistance in Southeast Asia throughout the decades, it's when I said that it's really courteous and really taking into account the sensitivities of Southeast Asia, we know that the Japan has rarely made comments and has in fact given any word about, for example, the lack of democracy, human rights record, and even governance issues facing Southeast Asian countries, unlike, for example, relatively Western powers in that regard. So I think in at least in the summit, while I think there might be some hint of it, but I think like Japan might want and ASEAN might want to talk about really emphasizing and putting more substance in these shared principles and values that may seem to be basically peace and stability and maybe comprehensive development. But other than that, we know that there's a large democratic deficit in the region. In fact, if you ask Freedom House, only Timor-Leste, a non-member of ASEAN, is judged free by Freedom House throughout the entire region. And much of the work of Japan has been building towards democratization. It's a huge involvement in peace building, for example, has touched on this, but without necessarily calling it as such, as we've seen with Western foreign aid or the conditionalities of conventional foreign aid regimes. So I think that's the one missing for me.
Thank you. Sharon or Kiba-san?
Yes.
Yeah.
So may I? Yeah. So as I mentioned in the first remarks, obviously the peace and stability part, the security cooperation part has no tangible action plan yet. It's quite difficult. So that's how we can go right now. That's the limitation. But I believe that such absence, the question says lack. What is insufficient? So that kind of absence or shortage of the security kind of cooperation, what we can do together for the peace and stability of the region, is also a uniqueness to Japan-ASEAN relations compared to the Western democracies, the other Western democracies. So we cannot go beyond. But that is a uniqueness of Japan, that we just keep it idle.
I
Thank you,
just wanted
Sharon.
to add on that, one of the things that I felt has been missing, in fact, not just from the summit, but in the last, 50 years of assistance to Southeast Asian countries, is the fact that there has been no focus on strengthening domestic rule of law. So on the one hand, there's been a lot of emphasis on upholding international rule of law. I think we cannot forget that the domestic side has to be looked at as well. And this kind of ties in with what Aries is saying, right, about democracy and freedom across the region actually being on a decline. And we see that, across the region quite strongly in the last few years, as we encounter even other forces that are at play, including forces of disinformation and misinformation coming into play. And this really works to destabilize societies in the region. So I think the focus in particular the pillar that Saya Sensei talked about that has not very many concrete initiatives, is to really kind of, you know, offer, besides promoting dialogue, is to maybe work towards strengthening the domestic rule of law in the member states, so that, you know, it brings everyone up on par and puts everyone on an equal playing field.
Thank you. Let's pivot a little bit here. Our next question is from a consultant from the Philippines. What are your thoughts on the Asia Zero Emission Community's impact for ASEAN and Asia? What will it take for AZEC, I'm not sure we've really established how we're supposed to pronounce that. I'm going to go with AZEC, to make a real and lasting influence. Sharon, I think you mentioned energy cooperation in your opening remarks. So can I ask you to start on the future role and impact of AZEC?
Yeah, I have to qualify that I am myself still trying to understand a little bit more and find a bit more details of AZEC. As I understand, it was announced actually last year, not this year, and in the initial announcement, it was to also help the individual ASEAN member states with sort of improving on their nationally determined contributions, and to ensure that they can deliver on those commitments. It is an interesting grouping because it actually includes Australia. So, so this begs the question of, actually, I think, how are these 9 ASEAN member states, including Japan and Australia, going to bring forth this community, and what will this community do? Besides just having a dialogue and forum, is there actually going to be a real exchange of transfer of technologies? It's going to be exchange of R&D, or to, you know, kind of work on other areas besides just focusing on using low carbon technologies? Could they also be working on other areas, including very basic bread and butter to climate issues, like, you know, sustaining your forests, preserving them, conserving your biodiversity, and so on? So I think some of these questions are still left unanswered. How will it actually create lasting value? I suppose is in pulling together as a very low-hanging fruit, to share your best practices with each other, and to kind of understand each other's constraints in, you know, trying to meet the Paris Agreement temperature limits. As of now, what I see, the AZEC kind of conversations that's happening at the sidelines is really focusing on more the technological aspects. And it's a little worrying, because then if you only focus on technology and not, you know, as you can see, technology also has become a kind of like a driver for economic growth. In ASEAN, for instance, they've kind of really jumped on the EV bandwagon, right? They've created a roadmap for an EV ecosystem to try to pivot from conventional vehicles, 4-wheelers, 2-wheelers, to the EV models. And actually, in part, it's also seen as a potential driver for new economic growth for their automotive industry. So whether that eventually really meets true climate mitigation targets, you know, remains to be seen. Of course, it will play some part in reducing the poor air quality, but if you continue to charge up your EV using fossil fuel, it's not going to make any difference. So the bigger issue is, how can you decarbonize your entire power generation sector? I think some of these are still left unanswered.
Thank you. Next up, we have a question from a professor from the Philippines. How can the convergence of the youth's experience and people-to-people exchange skills and capacity building contribute to shaping an ideal relationship between ASEAN and Japan? Aries, would you like to start on this? Because I think you had the most to say about the importance of educational exchange in your remarks.
Right. I think, like, well, we know of the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, the YSELI of the US as well. But we know, you know, before even this mechanism has been born, Japan's investment in somehow creating a network between Japan and Southeast Asians have existed. There's this ship for Southeast Asia that's been a ship donated by the government of Japan, of which Southeast Asians have participated, and I think it's been going on for decades. I think in terms of how best to converge efforts is that for Japan to continue its sustained commitment of investing in human capital development. As we have seen, Japanese universities are the best in the world. But at the same time, we also know that increasingly a lot of Japanese students are going to Southeast Asia for their studies. And this has been, in fact, promoted by both the Japanese government as well as Southeast Asian governments. But I think if there are more efforts to not only consider building a network or a more reliable mechanism, perhaps in future ASEAN-Japan summits, a dialogue with the youth or a dialogue with young Southeast Asians in order to cross the generational divide is something that could be included. But apart from the spectacle of the summit, of course, is more sustained interaction between the youth, because in the end, I think ASEAN's population remains very young, and while Japan has its own demographic challenges, it can still engage Southeast Asian countries in terms of youth exchanges and being able to talk about 21st century issues, because this generation has a different point of view, which most of us in this panel might not be able to fully comprehend or understand.
That felt like it was calling us all old, but I'm going to let it slide.
I'm bringing you all in that ship.
Saya, you as our Japanese educator on the panel, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yes. Well, yes. I see the clear difference between the young generation and the senior generation in terms of how to observe the goodness of Japan. There's no social scientific proof. I have no evidence yet, but I feel. I sense that there is a clear difference. So the older generation or the senior generation, they always describe Japan as like Japaneseness is good, discipline, politeness, the hardworking. That kind of Japaneseness is very important for the senior generation. But for the younger generation, they more focus on the institutionalization of Japan. So the strong institution, like the rule making or the rule following, rule taking, that kind of thing. So the solid base is not the nationality or the people's attitude, but the institution. That's what I sense when I talk to the Southeast Asian students or the Southeast Asian youth who is visiting or living in Japan.
Thank you. This will probably be our last question from the audience, and it comes from a researcher from Malaysia. There's been talk of Japan and ASEAN economies based on co-creation. Given the disparities between the economies and countries in the region, how can this idea of co-creation be effectively realized? And I'd say maybe we can each have 2 minutes on this, and any other closing thoughts you might have. Who would like to go first?
I'll just start by saying that co-creation, the word co means that it's jointly done together. And that's what gives me hope that the relationship, as I mentioned in my opening statement, is one that will place all parties on an equal footing. And it recognizes that every party has their own strengths to bring to the table to create something together. And in this regard, I don't think there has been anything that has been set by the Japanese government, but better be it by direction or by the agenda or by a particular sector. It is open to ideas from all parties. I think that's important to maintain that open-mindedness. and to bring on board, different ideas, including, as we mentioned earlier, about talking about the convergence of youth's experiences, including by bringing in the youth leaders, the business leaders, to come in and to co-create, to bring about something that's new, a more innovative, a different way of doing things. I think that's what it means, and it also doesn't just take the old model of kind of taking advantage of the comparative advantages of different countries. For instance, taking advantage of the cheaper labor or the availability of raw resources, but actually looks at how each party can bring their own value to the table.
Thank you, Sharon. Aries?
I mean, the disparities between ASEAN, these will likely stay. The ASEAN divide has existed ever since the organization has grown from its original members, and I think this makes while many see this as a negative, that while you have this divide between the new members and the old members, that's seeing it really as half empty rather than half full. I think this gives ASEAN its diversity. Part of its diversity is that we're all coming from different points of beginnings and different contexts, but I think the future of co-creation also rests upon the ability of ASEAN members to continue seeing the organization as not simply as a summit that the country has to attend to every year, but really a platform to pursue mutual goals. I've always said that as long as there will be an increasing gap between the individual interest of ASEAN members and the collective interest of the organization, the future of ASEAN is in danger. It is only when this convergence remains. And I think in terms of Japan coming in, what I observe is that Japan is always a less stressful power to deal with compared to some of the dialogue partners that ASEAN needs to deal with over the history. Apart from this sustainability of commitment, is the idea that Japan is not really coming to ASEAN with an imposition. And I think this has something to do with Japan's ability to focus not just on shared outcomes or goals, but on the process itself. We know that the destination is as important, the journey is as important as the destination. And Japan's ability to read ASEAN's preference for the importance of consultation, dialogue, patience, etc., is something that in the future Japan could leverage. That we're not just here because we want certain things from you, but we're here because we want to join hands in pursuing the many challenges that both Japan and ASEAN faces.
Thank you. Saya, your closing thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, we can just pick up the possible agenda, including the disaster relief or disaster risk reduction, climate change, sustainable energy transitions, or the food supply chain, or public health. So those are the area we share together. We share that together, and then we share the common threat perceptions, the non-traditional threat. So we can just pick up the possible area of cooperation. Of course, it is difficult. I understand the meaning of the question. So, for example, the AZEC, the Asia Zero Emission Community. Yes, so sorry, we're still very new in this area. It is very unfortunate that Myanmar was not included. Simply because Myanmar was not invited to the summit, the ASEAN summit. So, but it is, if as long as it is a business dialogue, as long as it's a business-oriented initiative, the Myanmar should be invited, right? Or in some other way, like not the summit level, but not the government-to-government level, but we need the multi-layer dialogue, including the business community, civil society, etc., to tackle with those kind of non-traditional kind of challenges.
Thank you. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. I hope the audience all agrees. After 50 years of Japan-ASEAN cooperation, it's clear that there is still an infinite number of issues to work on, including all the issues related to the new 21st century economy and Japan's new emerging role as a regional security provider, which is being welcomed in Southeast Asia in a way that would have been difficult to imagine even a decade ago, largely because of Southeast Asia's need to navigate a rising China and US-China tensions. That's all the time we have. I hope that those watching will tune in for the next in this series of webinars, which will be on disinformation and will take place in early 2024. We are always looking to improve the series, and so there is a post-webinar satisfaction survey that we would encourage you to fill out. You can scroll down the page to find that. Finally, let me thank the sponsors, Nikkei and the government of Japan, and especially let me thank our panelists who have given their time this evening for them, Ms. Sharon Seah, Professor Aries Arugay, and Professor Saya Kiba. Thank you all very much, and thank all of you who have tuned in. Have a nice night.